This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. And we are back with another action-packed, fun-filled episode of Art of Darkness, the podcast about the dark side of creativity. Patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Support the show. That's Art of Dark Pod. If you enjoy what we do, we would certainly appreciate your support. You get an extra mini episode after every episode that we do if you support the show that way. And it occurred to me, well, first, I'm Kevin Kautzman, and I'm joined by Brad Kelly. Brad, how are you?
I'm doing real well, man. I'm fresh out of the woods. I was where the trees have ears and the fields have eyes, and I was consulting with, well, I'm not going to say who I was consulting with yet, but in prep for this episode. So there you go.
You're talking to the owls,
yeah,
out in
right.
the woods.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and it occurred to me that we're doing something of an ad hoc survey of art history as we go, as we do this podcast, as we accidentally do this podcast.
Yes.
And I'm just going to say, it's pretty important work.
Hey man, I tell you what, I am learning a ton. I mean, I know your educational background. I've got a degree in English, a master's degree in writing. And I feel like I've learned more about literary and artistic history doing this podcast for a year and a half than in all of that. So
got my junior high graduation certificate right over here.
That's right.
And
that's right.
Yeah, we're doing important work, which I like to think makes the podcast important. But we know, of course, as podcasters, that no podcast is important.
Well,
not really. and yet
here we are.
Here we are, and we persevere, and we appreciate your support. We love hearing from people. The show has gained a little bit of traction where periodically somebody will reach out. They'll give us a little note. We'll get a new Patreon subscriber. Yeah. We'll hear from somebody on Twitter. We love that. And of course, Brad, you run the Twitter account, which is at Art of Dark Pod, and you've been doing a fabulous job with that.
Thanks, man.
You don't just post, hey, here we're doing this episode on Sarah Kane. You dig a little deeper, and I think that account is a good follow, whether you follow the show or not.
I like to think so. Yeah. Leading up to this, in the last week, I kind of haven't, because I literally, as I said in the lead up, I literally was out in the middle of the woods trying to not be on my phone. So I didn't do it this week, but leading up to this for the last 3-4 weeks, I was doing sort of mini Art of Dark episodes, one tweet episodes on Renaissance early modern artists. So you'd get a post on the relevant bio of an artist, some of their images, and then some follow-up tweets, something interesting about their lives. And I think for somebody who didn't know anything about any of that stuff, just to click on those few minutes, read every day, I think it would have been pretty interesting. So, and maybe even if you knew about it, find something new. So I try to do that, make it relevant to the show, what we're doing, and make it kind of an adder to the listening experience. Yeah.
Yes, the Art of Darkness experience. And of course, we are well into our second season doing this show, and I think it's worth pointing out that we're returning to our roots here. It's just you, it's just me.
Yeah.
I lit a candle.
Yeah.
I'm in the mood, and I'm ready. I'm ready to go back to our roots.
I like it. Yeah. We did 5 episodes last month, and they all had guests. They were all wonderful. They were all amazing. It was a banner month, but yes.
Yes, we love having guests. It's wonderful. But the core premise of the show, or the premise of the show, is that Brad and I get together and we do an episode where one of us educates ourselves, our ignorant self,
Mhm.
in order to walk the other through the life of an artist. And we call those episodes, those are core episodes.
Mhm.
And again, accidentally, we discovered that we needed another category of episodes for guests who wanted to come on or who want to come on
Yes.
to talk about the core episodes. And those episodes are called dark room episodes. And every episode gets a mini episode called After Dark,
Yes.
which is for the Patreon subscribers at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. We've also thrown in just kind of, I think, like a little bit of an indulgence for ourselves,
Mhm.
these movie watch along
Yes.
episodes. Yes. And we did 2001: A Space Odyssey, and
Mhm.
we are preparing to do my favorite film, There's Blood in the Water, Jaws, with the
I thought you were
great
going to say Piranha 3D.
with Blauer guys, friend of the show, Blauer guys,
Yeah.
who did the Disney episode
Yeah,
with us.
correct.
So we've got lots of good stuff, but this is the Beatles going
Yeah.
back to the studio, going
That's
back to
right.
their roots, right?
That's right.
We are, we've put down the electric guitars. We're sitting around the campfire, and who are we talking about today on this core episode, Brad?
We are talking about Hieronymus Bosch.
Hieronymus.
Say it with me. Hieronymus.
Hieronymus.
Yes,
Hieronymus.
yes. Latin for Jerome. The Latinized version in Hieronymus Bosch's head of Jerome. So yeah, for those folks who followed us and come to our show for episodes on modern and near contemporary literary figures, we decided we'd give you exactly what you came for, and we'd go back nearly 600 years to a Northern Renaissance painter about which almost nothing is known.
We have to begin with the question, of course,
Yes.
Brad, which you need to ask.
Yeah, and that's where I was going next, Kevin. What do you know about Hieronymus Bosch?
I know that I have The Garden of Earthly Delights, which I'm looking at it right now. It's a triptych. I have it over here. You sent it to me.
Mhm.
It is a bit of a cliche. It is the kind of thing that an undergrad who fancies themselves a certain way might buy and put on the wall.
I did that, and I have that on my wall over here. Yeah.
Well, I think you've been to grad school, Brad. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, fine. I do also know there's a little sliver of the garden from the middle lower left of the triptych that Dead Can Dance uses on one of their album covers.
Oh, the central panel?
Mm-hmm. Well, they use a portion of it, the little bubble.
Okay.
I know that from Dead Can Dance, who are one of my favorite musical groups and have been for a long time.
Okay.
And that is it.
Okay.
That's all I know. Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you to do one more thing before we dive into it. Because this is an audio only podcast and we're talking about a painter, I was thinking, how are we going to do this? And I decided we'd focus primarily on this one image, which is kind of considered his masterpiece. If a person's only familiar with one Bosch painting, it's Garden of Earthly Delights. Kevin, in a handful of sentences, how would you describe the Garden of Earthly Delights?
It's a triptych. Looking from the left to the right, we seem to move from the Garden of Eden into a kind of chaotic scene that I would think might be limbo or earth, or an allegory for the pleasures of life. And then to the right, we seem to be moving into hell, or the tortures of the damned.
Yeah.
I
think that's fair. Yeah, I think that's fair. One thing I would note too. Well, we'll get into it. So let's just jump into it. So the guy who created this, we call him now Hieronymus Bosch. His birth name was not Hieronymus Bosch. It was, well, every time it appeared in a legal document, it was spelled a little differently. So we're going to say it was either Jerome or Jeremiah von Aken. And we don't know a whole lot more about him than that, but I'm going to give you everything we know for a fact, and then I have an idea about how we can maybe try to maybe triangulate or quadrangulate who he might actually be from various interpretations. Plus, I'm going to give you the history of this painting after his death, which is actually pretty fascinating. So, we don't know a whole lot about him. He's born Jerome or Jeremiah van Aken around 1450 in the town of 's-Hertogenbosch in the Netherlands. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong because it's got an S, an apostrophe, a dash. I could be saying it wrong. Kevin, maybe you know better than I do that.
I'm not going to attempt that.
Okay.
It sounds to me like you did a fabulous job. And if there are any Dutch listeners who'd like to give us a hard time,
I practiced that one.
Very nice. Well done.
Yeah, the place is typically called even by the locals is called Den Bosch. Okay, and our Bosch took his name from the city, which I kind of like it. He took his name, he Greekified it into Hieronymus, and then he put the name of this town from it. It's almost like a rapper thing. Like I'm Cornelius Detroit. It's like very
right. Yeah, it's like a rapper thing, or like like a spicy Twitter anon.
Yeah, right. So I kind of dig that. Now we don't know a whole heck of a lot about him biographically. He exists in only 53 archival documents that have been found. In only 12 of these is it something where he's acting on his behalf. So there's various loans and legal proceedings that aren't particularly interesting that mention him in some capacity or another. But almost none of these have anything to do with his art. And when they do, they're very, very minor things. We don't have the document we don't actually know for a fact who even commissioned this altarpiece that is the Garden of Earthly Delights. The documents we do have related to his art are very small. Like he helped design some stained glass for a chapel. He painted some antlers for the same chapel, and that's kind of it legally from an art standpoint. But we do know a little bit about his family tree. So he comes from an artistic family. His great-grandfather, his grandfather, his father, and all three of his brothers were working artists, though as far as we know, none of their work has survived to the present day. So nobody knows what any of this looks like. We don't know if there's a family Bosch style. It's very possible. We have no idea.
You got Bosch, kid.
Well, it's funny. We'll get to it. In the 1600s in Spain, to call an artist a Bosch was an insult.
All right, cool.
So his grandfather, Jan van Aken, came to 's-Hertogenbosch or Den Bosch, which is in the North Brabant, what is now the Netherlands, sort of in the middle, picture in your mind's eye, in the middle of a triangle between Brussels, Amsterdam, and Dusseldorf.
I went to public schools, Brad. I can't.
I'll have
to look it up. Yeah.
Yeah. Amsterdam's where weed's legal. Brussels is where Jean-Claude Van Damme came from.
Right.
And then I don't know what Dusseldorf. There's probably something from Dusseldorf. Bosch is sometimes referred to as a Flemish painter, though territorially that's not quite accurate, but I suppose that's good enough. It's almost what used to be called Flanders. He probably apprenticed for a time in his father's shop, though we don't actually know that. We'll get to some extraordinary claims and evidence a little bit later. But I'm trying to just lay out what we actually know for a fact. And I'm almost done because we don't know a whole heck of a lot. So we know one thing, that in 1463, the town of Den Bosch it burned almost entirely to the ground. So he would have been a child of 8 to 13 years old, and his hometown burned to the ground.
I think we have a tendency to forget how frequently that would happen. Somebody would tip over a lantern or a candle. And the whole city, London in 1666, half the town or whatever it is.
Yeah. And I think most art historians agree that if you look in the right-hand panel, what's called the Hell panel of the Garden of Earthly Delights, and you see the structure fires in the background, that was likely the burning of Den Bosch was likely the inspiration for that. There is some claims that this is the earliest, most accurate portrayal of structure fire in a painting. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but it does look pretty realistic, I would say.
Hell
Yeah.
Panel is a great name for a metal band.
It is a great name for a metal band. It really is. Everything about this, like if you name any one thing in this image and give it a name, you could call your metal band that pretty much.
Right. Earthly
Rapacious owl.
delights. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Cool. All right, man.
um, um, so we do know that he went to a school run by the religious community called the Brethren of the Common Life. This was a religious school, emphasized meditation, the inner life, severity against sin. Another famous alumni of that school was Erasmus, who, for people who don't know, wrote In Praise of Folly, was a great humanist thinker, sort of not part of the Reformation.
Pre-Reformation.
Right, but somebody who inspired, in some ways, inspired the Reformation, we could say. But a heavy hitter, a philosophical heavy hitter for the the 1500s. He went to the school, but he was 10 to 20 years younger than Bosch. This is a very religious town, and this is really important to understand. St. John's Cathedral, which is a beautiful cathedral. I was looking at pictures of this in reference to this, is sort of centered there. 1 in 16 people in the town worked for the church in some capacity or another. And for a fairly small city, there were something like 60 religious fraternities and groups that people were parts of. So the church is in the center of town. It's an extremely religious place. And I think you can't disentangle that from Bosch's life, whatever we come to decide his religious tendencies were. He married into a wealthy landowning family, and he didn't have any children. And it used to be suspected or thought that the reason that he didn't have any children was that he married a much older woman, like he was 20 and he married a woman who was 50, that kind of thing. But later archival research has suggested that the woman he married was confused with his aunt, who had the exact same name. So most likely he married a woman roughly his age, though they did not have any children. Marrying her, though, made him immediately much wealthier. So by the time
good move,
he did a good,
all right,
yeah, exactly.
If you want to do art, you can do a lot worse.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so, shortly, by the time Bosch is, say, 30, he's in legal documents, he's paying more in taxes than his father. So that he immediately jumped up in social mobility, though we don't know how much money he made from art. We have literally zero idea how much money he made from art, even though we know when he bought an acreage here and sold an acreage there. We know all of that.
Over in my playwriting life, you got to allow me something, Brad. Sure. Over in my playwriting life, there's this young playwright named Monty D. Montalegre, and we're doing his play, It's All Red, like a metaphor or something, as part of the theater company. And he has a play that he named after a concept that he and his friend came up with, and it was sort of like a phrase. He asked his friend, "What is the female equivalent of a sugar daddy?" And the friend said, "A salt mother." So he has a play called Salt Mother, and I think it sounds like Bosch he married. It's not a salt mother, but you get the idea.
Something
you see why I mentioned it.
Yes, that's hilarious. Salt Mother. Now, other than just making him more money, it immediately rose Bosch in social standing. So he became he may have been a member of the outer circle of this originally and then moved into the inner circle, but he was a lifelong member of something called the Illustrious Brotherhood of Our Blessed Lady, which was a religious confraternity that still exists, that was sort of attached to St. John's Cathedral at the time. The inner circle of this was called the Brotherhood of the Swan, and Bosch was a member of the Brotherhood of the Swan, which was immediately raised you to, it was somewhere between the Kiwanis Club and City Council to be a member of the Brotherhood of the Swan. Now, it's interesting because before I did this research, I knew Bosch. I'd done a little bit of reading on him before because I have this painting in my, a print of it obviously in my place, and kind of thinking about it. And I had thought he was this sort of isolated guy out in this small town, and that made the art that he created even crazier to me, because it was like, what is this, just kind of born out of nothing? Like it's even more radical if you think of him as like some farm boy who's coming up with this. That's not quite accurate. So as a member of this Brotherhood of the Swan, I think we can see that he was tied more broadly into European culture than it might seem obvious from the town that he was in. And one way we can kind of see this is there was another guy. There was a bunch of people in the Brotherhood of the Swan, most of whom, may have been important at the time, but we wouldn't know them now for what, 500 years ago, or close to it, 400 years at least. But one guy who was a member of the Brotherhood of the Swan was this guy, Frederick of Egmont. And Frederick of Egmont was counselor to Maximilian I, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. Right.
Uh-huh.
So
okay.
Bosch
hanging out with the guy. Okay.
Right. There's records of Bosch having the annual Brotherhood of the Swan dinner at his house where they would eat a swan. And
wait. Wait, they're eating the swans?
They're eating the swan. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure why it's called Brotherhood of the Swan exactly. I couldn't.
Well, because they're eating the swans, Brad.
They're eating the swan. But why are they eating the swan?
Well, why wouldn't you? It's protein, Brad. This is the Middle Ages. It's not.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true. But so the year that Frederick of Egmont joins the Brotherhood of the Swan is the same year that Bosch has the dinner at his house. So he is 2 steps removed from the Holy Roman Emperor, right? So he's not this isolated guy out in the middle of a farm field. He is connected to the greater movements of European history at the time, late medieval European history. As I mentioned, Bosch and his wife have no kids, but and this I'm going to hit that point a couple of times because it's important to the later interpretations. They do take in a nephew and raise him, and the nephew seems to be very happy about this and names his own son Hieronymus, yada, yada, yada. And then in 1516, Hieronymus Bosch, at the age of around 66, dies, most likely of the plague.
The plague.
The Black Death has been long over, but the plague kind of comes and goes. It will move into town, kind of like the weather, and you're going to lose some people. And in this case,
very strict attention, people. We are learning history.
That's right. Now, I want to, and we know a little bit about his status from his funeral, which was not a huge deal, but I've got something here that says his funeral cost the same as about a week's pay for a craftsman. So it was a sort of a moderate size, and there was a lot of attendees, and people knew who Bosch was in the town of Den Bosch. Now, because all of our previous episodes have occurred, we're not doing somebody born in 1900, not doing somebody born in 1800. We're doing somebody born in 1450. I want to give you a little bit of historical context, just so you understand where are we relative to some other historical milestones you might know, right? The Black Death had happened about 100 years before Bosch's birth. So the worst of it, when Europe lost a third of its population, it still hadn't recovered its population by the time of Bosch's, obviously. Yeah.
We're going to be talking a bit about the Black Death when we do, I believe, our next core episode on the great French actor and playwright Antonin Artaud. Because he was deeply influenced by thinking about the plague. One of his key essays is called "The Theater and the Plague." So we will be Black Death pilled both on this episode and the episode to come.
Okay, all right. Well, that's very interesting, and these things are all connected, man. We've got Europe discovering the New World in 1492, right? So that's in Bosch's lifetime. Columbus sails the ocean blue. I know people want to say, well, they didn't discover it. There were already people living there. But yeah, it was still a big deal to Europeans to find it, right? I mean, it's still a huge cultural shift. You've got Leonardo da Vinci, who's painting the Mona Lisa, which frankly, over the last month of investigating all these Renaissance painters, I'm hugely unimpressed by the Mona Lisa.
Have you been to the Louvre though? Have you been to see it?
haven't.
You Philistine.
But dude, go look at a Jan van Eyck. Go look at Raphael.
Sure. Yeah. Rembrandt.
Leonardo da Vinci, a genius. I just don't get the Mona Lisa. So at this time, we also have Copernicus coming up with his sun-centered model of the solar system. We've got Christian Europe facing an onslaught from the Ottomans. We've got the Reformation just about to happen. And like any major historical vibe shift like that, there's lead-ups to it that aren't as clearly articulated, right, as nailing a list of demands on a door. It's a burbling up, and then that happens, and that's the moment, right? The Spanish Inquisition is also at its height. And
nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Expects it. Bosch probably did expect it to come knocking on his door at some point, and it never did. Within this context, we have the Northern Renaissance, which is distinct but not completely unentangled from the Italian Renaissance, right? It's slightly different. It has slightly different traditions, but much like the Italian Renaissance in painting, which was influence was paid for by the Medicis and the Vatican and all that. This is a little more DIY, I would say.
More provincial, parochial.
Yes. Yeah. But you still see enormous talents in that era. You see Jan van Eyck, who is a predecessor of Bosch. I don't think Jan van Eyck had the greatest of the paintings, but you can look at some key Jan van Eyck paintings and realize that nobody was more talented than him. Right. Yeah. They might have had a better painting, but nobody was more talented than Jan van Eyck.
That name is so fun too. It sounds like he should be putting up pop-ups in Santa Monica and charging you $800 for sneakers. These are Jan van Eyck's.
Right. That's very good.
Series 1.
A couple other things that are happening. Technology. The printing press came out in 1440, right? 10 years before Bosch is born.
Seismic shift.
Oh, huge.
Comparable to the internet.
Oh, absolutely. 1440, it's invented. By 1500, there have been over 20 million books printed. Right?
Whoa!
60 years, 20 million books. There's only 60 million people in Europe.
Right.
And the vast majority of them cannot read.
Everyone needs a library, and everybody needs a copy of the Bible. Everybody needs, I can imagine. Right. Wow.
Right. So then on top of this, you have this gradual humanistic / Reformation movement that's all kind of happening, right? So I just kind of wanted to place us there. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of his work that we know about, but again, I'm going to focus on the Garden of Earthly Delights. It's the most interesting. It's all good.
And Brad, what are we going to do for the Patreon? Do you have the subject for the Patreon episode?
I should have mentioned that. Yeah, I do. Yeah. We're going to talk about the connection, ideologically, philosophically, historically, between Bosch and the Nazis.
Oh,
yeah. All right. We're going to do a little Indiana Jones thing. It's going to be cool.
Ooh, right. So if you want to hear that, you've got to subscribe to the Patreon, patreon.com/artofdarkpod. So we'll talk about Bosch and the Nazis on the
After Dark episode. The connection is tenuous, but it is real. So, okay.
Wow. Okay.
Okay.
Oof, so I'm excited.
So the main painting we've got, this Garden of Earthly Delights, or that's not even the main painting we've got. It's the one everybody sees and talks about because it's probably the wildest and most novel. But there's shades from that to his most conventional. There's many, many shades of different amounts of novelty and innovation. There is the Adoration of the Magi, which we may talk about a little bit, the Marriage Feast at Cana, the Last Judgment, for which he did at least 3 different altar pieces, but we only have one complete.
That's funny. He's like, no, this is the Last Judgment. No,
for
this
real.
Is the last
Judgment
this time
2.
For real.
Electric Boogaloo. Yeah. He's got a Temptation of St. Anthony, which is great. He has a Haywain triptych, which I think is actually his funniest painting. And he's got many sketches and drawings. Earlier in his career, he had some pieces that weren't triptychs or altar pieces, but I think those were probably the high dollar items. So when he hit his mature period, he was doing, it seems like he was doing mostly these big altar pieces. And crazily enough, a lot of the stuff of his that survives is like one panel from an altar piece where there's 3 of them at least, but they're just gone. right? Lost to history. Nobody knows where they are. Now let's talk about the Garden of Earthly Delights. Okay, so some of the history of it, we don't know exactly who commissioned it for sure. It's speculation. But here's the thing that we do know. In July of 1517, about a year after Hieronymus Bosch's death, Cardinal Luigi of Aragon goes on his diplomatic tour of Europe, and he visits the palace of Count Henry III of Nassau. This palace has like these secret doorways and strange rooms and cabinets of wonder. And in one of these rooms is the Garden of Earthly Delights. And Joseph Leo Corner, this Harvard art historian, what he says about it is the room was where Count Henry III, when his dinner guests got drunk, he would sort of shove them in there as like a cruel joke, and they'd be wasted and they'd be confronted by the Garden of Earthly Delights. And it would have whatever effect it had on them. It'd get them horny or freak them out, or, it was a kind of a cruel joke that he liked to play on people. And Count Henry III of Nassau was, by all accounts, a pretty cruel guy. So that's where it is in July of 1517. Whether that was who commissioned it, was this Count Henry III or not, is not entirely clear. But that's where it ended up. Now, a little bit later, 1567, the Duke of Alba, who was seeking to crush heresy in the Netherlands, he expends a lot of time and resources to get his hands on it. The painting had been passed down to William of Orange. William of Orange was the Duke of Alba's sworn enemy, and the leader of the Protestants, by the way, though we're not going to get, super, super deep into all of that, but it is relevant.
The enemies of the one true faith.
That's right, exactly. Now, Alba was so obsessed with getting this painting that he actually seized the concierge of William of Orange and tortured the guy for 18 months to give up the location of the painting.
What do you mean tortured? Tortured how?
Breaking all of his bones, pulling out his nails, parts of his body were stripped to the bone. There was a period of time where he was so badly damaged that he couldn't eat. And then finally he gave up whether the location of the Garden of Earthly Delights was.
Why did he want the painting so much?
We're going to get into that a little bit more later during one of the interpretations. But I think what happened is, well, I'll kind of say it now, and then we'll explicate it further later. What Joseph Leo Corner says is that the center of it depicts a complete breakdown of religious and spiritual order and law. And Corner claims that the central panel could be used as almost like a meditative piece to inspire like a tyrannical urge to crush your enemies, right? It's like, if we don't get things under control, this is what it will be like. And so we have to crush all of our enemies, and it would like inflame that kind of passion in a leader like the Duke of Alba. Now, which, hey man, I don't know.
Maybe the guy was just a sadist.
Well, I think that's true. I think that's true too. Yeah. I think it was probably commissioned by a sadist, and then the sadists wanted to get it. King Philip II of Spain was also obsessed with getting. The only reason we have any of this Bosch stuff is because King Philip II spent but in today's standards, millions of dollars to obtain as many of these paintings as he possibly could. Now, Corner makes the claim, and I don't know how true it is because he says it with a wink, but he also seems like he's kind of serious about it, that, you had the Reformation, and then say 100 years later, you have the 30 Years' War. And then after the 30 Years' War, Europe is religiously divided in a completely new way, right? You've got the Catholics and the Protestants, the Habsburgs have lost power, but we're not a 30 Years War podcast in this case, but Corner claims that the Duke of Alba, all of the efforts he expended to seize this painting, the laws that he dismissed in order to seize this painting, was a domino in that change. And it was a domino in the process that led to the 30 Years' War, that led to all of these other things. So he says it's sort of inextricable from that history, literally this painting.
Where is this painting now?
Well,
Presently?
it was handed down by King Philip II, had it in his Cabinet of Wonders, and then it became part of the Escurial. It eventually was given to the Prado in Spain, and it has stayed there ever since in Madrid.
How large is it roughly, if you had to?
It's about 12 feet wide.
Oh, it's quite large.
It's big. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a big painting for sure. It's about right. So it might be 11 feet. So yeah. So I mean, I didn't realize how significant. I mean, I don't know that there's that many other paintings that you can really say. It's just a fascinating bit of history.
I mean, it's got a bit of that, doesn't it? It belongs in a museum.
Right. They're torturing guys and like keep whipping him until he gives it up. Right. You know,
this painting has magic powers. Yeah,
I think they kind of thought that it did. You know, yeah. Okay, so now that doesn't tell us a whole lot about who Bosch is, and we're not going to know a whole lot about who Bosch is, but we're going to have some ideas about who he could be. And I want to do that by walking you through some of the main interpretations of this painting specifically. Okay, so the basic interpretation, if you type in Google something called Garden of Earthly Delights Explained, this is the explained that they'll just give you, right? It's misogynistic Christian propaganda. That's it. It's misogynistic Christian propaganda trying to tell you that, you know, Eve sinned and tempted Adam, and that led to the fall, and then that took us all to hell.
Yeah, maybe there's more to it.
I think that's the thing. I don't necessarily even think that that's wrong. I think it's too simplistic because, I mean, look at this. Look at this thing.
Yeah, right? There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, exactly. So now the one thing, and they'll also, I don't like how they simplify the innovative qualities to it, the idiosyncrasies of it. There are a few things, touch points we can kind of reflect on that do help us understand why the style seems so innovative, because this thing doesn't even fit into Northern Renaissance trends either. It fits in. There's people who are copiers and followers of Bosch, but it doesn't fit into anything that came before him, seemingly. But if you kind of look at individual pieces, you start to realize that he was taking inspiration from what are called drolleries, which are margin sketches, often funny or obscene, from illuminated manuscripts, right?
Aha.
Our great friend Stephanie Leahy would probably know all about that.
Yeah, right. Drolleries, little. Oh, here's a little naked man, and
exactly. And he's farting and going like this. He's right. Little things like that. So that's one. Sure. Another thing that he's taking images from, almost certainly, is something called the Nuremberg Chronicle, which was a very early printed encyclopedia that had pictures of human history, pictures from the Bible, pictures of like mythological figures and things like that. But it would almost be like, it was like the equivalent of like a pulp magazine at the time, almost. Like, that's not a great analogy, but it's the closest thing they would have had to something like that. And Bosch almost certainly read it, because anybody who could read the Nuremberg Chronicle in that place in time. He was also drawing from, there had been some people say that he was drawing from observations by people who traveled to the New World. That may or may not be true. He was probably drawing from Albrecht Dürer, who he most likely met. Albrecht Dürer he has a famous drawing of a rhinoceros, which would have been very uncommon for people at the time. And there were some other people who traveled to Africa, and then they published like bestiaries of animals. So he may have been drawing from that as well. The giraffe in the Garden of Eden panel, he definitely took from one of those types of books. So I guess my point there is, despite all of the novelty, you can point at individual things and say, well, that's where that came from. That's where that came from. Some of it is coming from, there were a bunch of pamphlets or booklets at the time about these Irish visionaries' descriptions of hell, and some of those square with the hell panel. So he's inspired by things that are going on around him. And I don't mean to say that he's not coming up with any of this on his own, but as you contextualize it, you start to see like, okay, there is a reference for some of this stuff.
He's not going to pull this all wholesale out of his mind's eye.
Right.
He had never seen an elephant. I see an elephant. He had never seen a giraffe, etc. Yeah.
Right. Now, so now I'm going to get into one of the big interpretations, and this one held a lot of sway for a long time. This is called, we'll call this the Wilhelm Franger interpretation. Now, Wilhelm Franger wrote this monstrous book right here. Okay. And now you think that this is going to be just an art book, and there are plates of all the Bosch work, but it is, it's a book. And I read a good chunk of it, and it's fascinating and bizarre. Wilhelm Franger is a German, as you may have guessed, art historian, folklorist. Even his biggest critic said that he had a truly formidable knowledge of alchemy, Neoplatonism, and Gnostic lore. I love Gnostic lore, as well as ancient religions. So
Bosch had these things?
No. Sorry. Franger. I'm talking about Franger now.
Okay.
Yep. This is Franger interpretation. And this was one of like the biggest texts ever pulled together about Bosch specifically in the early 40s. So what Franger said, and it's interesting, and Terence McKenna and some other people found it convincing, and other people say it's completely nonsense, but it's interesting. Franger was convinced that Bosch was basically the court painter for the grand master of a secretive Adamite sect by the name of Jacob van Almengian. I'm probably mispronouncing that, who barely exists in the historical record at all. So now if Bosch was part of this sect, and no one in academia seems to agree with this, though Franger makes a reasonable case for such an outlandish claim, it does have profound relevance to this painting because it's an entirely heretical sect. I don't know, Kevin, have you ever heard the term Adamite?
I have, but I don't know much beyond just, maybe I read it in a book at some point. You're reading some crazy, conspiracy theory book. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Fair enough. And I didn't know much about it at all before getting into this either. I'd same thing. I'd kind of heard the term or whatever, and it says Adam in it. So it's got something to do with Adam. Right. But specifically, Adamites are Christians who have this ideology around Adam and Eve and the paradise. That's kind of where their focus is. I mean, they're Christian, sort of, I suppose. They're small. It was small and it was secretive, obviously. It was mostly run by the laity. And it's one of these groups, like a lot of Gnostic groups, though they're not Gnostics properly, I don't think, where the descriptions of them mostly come from their critics, right? Because they weren't writing their own stuff because they didn't want to get burned or hung, so they just made their groups, right? Right. So they're not writing pamphlets and distributing them. But I'm going to give you a description from the Franger of what the Adamites were like, and it's interesting. There are ways in which this painting could have Adamite influences, but we're going to have to kind of get our hands around what an Adamite is and why are they secretive and what's actually different about them. Right?
Adamite. Adamite.
That's right. Yeah, like of Adam.
Of
right?
Adam.
Yeah. The Adamites, and this is from the Franger. Actually, I think this is St. Augustine's description of the Adamites. The Adamites are called after Adam and emulate his paradisiac nakedness as it existed before the fall. They reject marriage because before Adam sinned and was expelled from paradise, he did not know his wife. They believe that there would have been no marriages later either if no one had sinned. So men and women assemble naked. Naked they listen to the readings, naked they pray, and naked they celebrate the sacraments. For this reason, they regard their church as paradise. Right? Another description.
I could see that bothering some of the people, bothering maybe the clergy and
exactly.
other people.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Here's another description. This guy, Theodoret, connects the Adamites with the sexually communistic Carpocratians, who proclaimed a natural law of free, equal, and communal ownership of all earthly goods, and even went to the excessive lengths of demanding free sexual intercourse with closest blood relatives, as well as public intercourse. According to Clement, a certain Prodicus, who is a Adamite, is said to have established excesses of this kind as a mystic communion. Right.
There's nothing new under the sun, is there, Brad?
There really isn't. There really isn't. I'm going to find another description of it as well. Be
careful out there, people. Try not to end up in a cult.
Yeah, exactly. And so the thing here is, what's important is, I've got one kind of description of this I really want to give you, and I need to kind of find it here. So the criticisms of this is by people like Joseph Leo Corner, who I respect immensely after doing all of this research, and whose interpretation we're going to dig into further, and is maybe the closest to the correct interpretation if there is one. But Joseph Leo Corner basically says, and others say, well, there were no Adamites. There were no Adamites around Den Bosch in 1450 to 1500, so this doesn't even make any sense. I did some further reading, and it turns out that there probably were some Adamites, or it's reasonable to suppose there were Adamite sects and that's SECTS.
Of course, indeed, yeah. Well, and I mean, to be rather blunt about it, is it because there's so much nudity in the painting, and they're thinking, oh, maybe this is an Adamite? This is a pitch,
right?
For the secret society.
Right. So what? And here's the logic, I think, where this works. And we're going to look at a couple individual aspects of the painting that I think are most convincing from Franger. But the thing you have to think about is the size of this painting and the style of it. This isn't something that Bosch would have been painting under his own on his own dollar, right?
He's not doing this on spec. Somebody commissioned this.
Right. Somebody commissioned this just because the size of it's huge, and it's in the style of an altarpiece, right? So if it's in the style of an altarpiece, it probably is being used as an altarpiece in some capacity. And altarpieces at that time, a triptych altarpiece in the north, what you would have had is a biblical scene in the center. And then flanking it, you would have most likely had a saint on either side. And those saints may have been the saint that the church was named after. Maybe if there was a saint that was regionally important or something like that. And that's the convention. You see, if you go through, late medieval triptychs, that's what almost all of them are. This clearly isn't that at all, right? There's no saints. You have God, and you have Adam, and you have Eve. Other than that, none of these are biblical figures or characters whatsoever, at least not on the face of it. So that's the one thing where it seems convincing to me that this could be the altarpiece for some kind of alternative group. That doesn't.
Yeah, really. They put the red light on. They play a little weird, funky, weird lute music.
Right, and they
put the altarpiece up, and they get their clothes off, and they're going to do the sacraments naked. Yes, that wouldn't offend anybody.
No, that would not bother anybody whatsoever. Right. I think I was going to try to find this one description. So, there was there were Adamites. So the one thing Corner and others say is there were no Adamites around. But here's the deal. So in 1250, there were 2,000 Adamites at least in Cologne, which isn't that far. And there were 1,000 in Paris. Now, that's 200 years before, but it's a secretive group, right? It's not, they're avoiding persecution. So, of course, you're not going to know everybody who's in the group, right? So I don't think it's ridiculous to assume that there may have been Adamites around Bosch. I don't think that's insane. Franger makes some leaps of logic because he doesn't have a lot of evidence. He says that Bosch is under this Grand Master who, like I said, barely exists in the historical record. Does seem to be a person, but very little other than that is known about him. But
that is the best kind of grandmaster to be, by the way.
Right.
Poof, you're gone. Poof.
Right.
If you're a grandmaster and everybody knows your name, you're doing it wrong. Unless you're Grandmaster Flash.
Right. Well, yeah, because your head's gonna roll.
Yeah. Be careful.
Yeah. So, they now we didn't. I feel like we didn't quite get into the religion of it, what an Adamite really is. So, the idea of it is that you can have, if you have sex, it doesn't matter. Marriage doesn't matter. And you are turned towards God. You are doing this and somehow in the glory of God, then it is not a sin, right? And,
No,
and
I'm
so,
an Adamite.
right, right, exactly.
We're all Adamites
we're
now.
living in an Adamite society right now. We just don't even know it.
Yeah, right.
So the idea is like, if you can restrain from it being completely an indulgence in sensual delight, although it's not that it's not sensually delightful, it's that you somehow don't fall for it and you don't forget God when you
It's a
do
bit of a
it.
Gnostic, a little Gnostic.
A little bit.
Yeah.
And the idea, I think, from reading some of this stuff is like, as you approach climax, that is a moment of like, of coming into union with God, the moment of climax with another person, right? And it's not really, I understand it's not conventional Christian, but like, it's not that crazy of a religious concept to me to think that you might make that moment some kind of sacred union thing, right? I mean, it's the moment of creation. It's,
of course, yeah. It's
so
pretty hardcore heresy.
it is. It's incredibly heretical, but to me, it's not.
Just also pretty metal. It's very. It actually reminds me of Mr. Crowley. We're going to get to it. This is great, Brad. I had no idea that you would get us to a sex cult when we were doing Hieronymus Bosch. Cool.
I tried to describe it in one phrase, and it's a Christian esoteric sex magic cult. Yeah, that's what they are. Yeah,
cool.
And I want to give you one quote that describes them, and then we're going to look at some individual parts of the painting. In the group that Franger says Bosch was part of was the Brethren of the Free Spirit, which was a real group. There's a book about just the Brethren of the Free Spirit out there. I read bits of it. This was when one of them was brought before. The best way we could describe it and understand it in modern mind is like a court proceeding where they were being prosecuted for being an Adamite. The one gentleman, Friar Willem, he said, "He who possesses the knowledge of God has paradise in his own breast. He who has mortal sin on his conscience, he has hell in his mouth like a rotten tooth." Ooh. So it's all a mindset thing, right? It's like, it's a sort of antinomian thing where like, I'm right with God, so I can't sin. Right? Like I'm actually, because you've achieved some kind of higher plane of existence in which you and God have a deal. Right?
I love this idea of Bosch wandering around. He's being commissioned to make a painting like the Garden of Earthly Delights. He might be part of this esoteric Christian heretical sex cult. He's eating swans.
Right.
Hanging out with the guy who knows the Holy Roman Empire. This is fascinating. And of course, we're in the realm of speculation here, Brad. We are.
Yeah. But this is the thing with the guy that so little is known about. You almost have to speculate a little bit. Like every one of these interpretations at some point takes a leap of faith. Every single one of them, and so it kind of comes down to like which leap is most is easiest for you to take. I don't really 100% buy the Franger interpretation, but I do think it tells us something about the anxieties of people around that time, and I do think aspects of the painting can be read this way.
There's an awful lot of nudity in the painting.
There is, right? Yeah,
and there are numerous naked bodies.
Right. Oh yeah. No, there's no way around it. So, so I want to let's talk about a couple of the images. So in the central panel, for folks who are listening at home, in the middle panel, almost in the cutting crossways, almost across the middle of the central panel, there's an area that I'm going to call the vortex. And this is a parade of people, of men riding animals. And in the middle of that, there is a circular sort of body of water where there are women. There are no women on the riding the animals around the outside. I'm going to call this the vortex, and I'm going to mention this in a couple of different interpretations. Now, here's how Franger describes that vortex. The profusion of fertility symbols because it's all these men riding naked men riding a bunch of different animals and naked women in the middle, right? Okay, so he's calling this a profusion of fertility symbols, and the jaunty, high-spirited merriment of this ceremonial cavalcade show that it is part of a vegetation cult whose object is to promote the fertility of the earth through the mana emanating from the sexual potency of the fruits, animals, and young men. But a moral didactic idea is also associated with this magical function. The animals being ridden are incarnations of the instincts, which are seen in a positive light as the sustaining forces of nature. The riders harness and master these instincts, but do not abuse the animalistic bearers of life through excessive use of rein or spur. Their old masters, the birds, establish a wise balance. The young men whom the birds once ushered into life now bring it to the wisdom of their masters. All young lovers believe their happiness to be unique, to be a unique, wholly novel experience, far beyond the ordinary. What they must strive for in this nuptial hour is the attainment and preservation of a lasting balance between sensual happiness and peace of the soul, the integrity of innocent love, even in the most sensual delight. This is regarded as the highest mastery of life, the crown of creation, whose symbol, the pure egg, is carried in the glorious triumphal procession, solidly balanced on the head of a young man. Now, if you look at the lower part of the vortex, there is a guy carrying an unbroken white egg on his head. I don't know if you can see that. It's sort of the very...
when you first start your Twitter account.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's important. I think it's important to note too, that egg is in the dead center of the central panel. The whole thing is aligned to that egg. I think that does actually matter. Okay, so that's how Franger sees the vortex. I'm going to talk about another important symbol in this painting that we're going to see in multiple interpretations, and that's from the hell panel that we're going to call the tree man. So you see the guy, he's got a big white butt, but it's carved out. He's got the disc on his head, his tree legs.
Sure.
You see him, right? He's one of the more novel, kind of unusual creatures in this whole thing. Okay, so let me tell you what Franger thinks of that. Let's see. Right in the midst of hell stands a monster, harshly lighted, jagged, and incoherent in outline. Its feet are stuck into great boats. Its legs are rotting tree branches, some kind of metamorphic joint, half knee, half elbow, leads to a shoulder out of which the trunk of the infernal creature swells like a burst egg. Withered limbs branching out from the legs have pierced its corpse-colored shell. The head looks back over the shoulder. Out of the livid, melancholy face, two eyes scan the night of hell. Their glance does not meet ours. On its head, the monster carries a disc on which stands a pink bagpipe with lascivious couples disguised in fantastic costumes promenading ceremoniously around it. The same bagpipe appears again on a smaller scale on a flag hoisted above the cracked egg. The interior of the egg is a fantastic, sinister tavern where in the flickering firelight, three guests sit around a pitcher on a bare table while the infernal hostess fills another pitcher from the barrel. A man, tired of all the racket, leans on the rim of the eggshell, looking down at the icebound water in which the ghastly creature's boat feet are frozen fast. Taken as a whole, this monstrosity looks more like a duck than anything else. This is how the late Gothic imagination might have imagined the mythological Nemesis, the goddess of the primeval world who assumed the form of a goose and, according to Eratosthenes, brooded the fateful world egg. So this is
Aristophanes?
No, it's not. That's not that. It's Eratosthenes. Anyway,
I'm not going to try to do it.
I can't pronounce it. I know. That's how I tried. My mouth tried to pronounce what you said, but that's actually not what it is. So this is a sort of a satanic figure, right? And I think clearly that's fair to say for any of these interpretations. That's what most of them are going to point to. Now, one thing I want to point out about this painting, and this is to me the most convincing part of the Franger interpretation. Okay. So in the Franger interpretation, this is an Adamite sect. The middle panel is actually the paradise we can live in if we come into union with God. That's the idea, right? You could live in this place. It's beautiful. You get to have your sensual desires. You get to live in union with God. The fall never kind of happened, right? Now, if you look, trying to figure out the best way, it's in the lower right corner the lower right quarter of the central panel, okay, there is, you see a red kind of teepee thing with some people in it. It's a fairly bright red.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
And I'm going to encourage people who are listening to this podcast. We will do our best to describe it for you so you can imagine it in your mind's eye. But it probably wouldn't hurt to
look
just
at it.
Look at the painting too.
Yeah. I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
I see the sort of red. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if you go just below and to the right of that, there is a kind of a orangish coral colored portal sort of thing.
Yeah, sure.
Where people are coming out.
Right.
And they're coming out from underground from the direction of hell. Okay. So now Bosch claims, or Franger claims, that there's one figure in there who looks a little older than everybody else. Everybody else in this is kind of a nubile young person. There's one figure Franger claims is a little bit older.
Yeah.
Heck yeah. Franger claims this is the Grand Master of the Adamite sect, showing people the way out of hell, which is the interiorized existence they have living in reality, and bringing and guiding them back to paradise. Now, this is the thing. This whole Adamite thing is a ridiculous claim. None of the other interpretations explain what that is. What that portal thing is.
Interesting.
Nobody else even talks about it.
It's a little bit of like a Doctor Who telephone booth type thing, isn't it?
Right.
With this lovely orange color. And the orange, now that I look more closely, the palette of that portal does seem reminiscent of the palette of hell. The orangishness. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. So I'm not saying the Franger interpretation is right, but there are some oddities that the Franger is able to explain some things that some other people aren't able to explain. Now
that Franger guy, he's up to something.
Other people are able to explain stuff he doesn't explain, and some of his claims are a little ridiculous. I want to point you to, now here's how out of whack Franger gets. I'm going to point you to one more thing from his, maybe one or two more Franger things, but one, I want to show you how kind of crazy he is. Okay. So if you go in the central panel, you move up to up near the top third, there are these 5 strange structures, right?
Yes, I see them.
Okay, now the left one, the pink one, if you look at the lower corner where it meets the water, it's very small, but there are these dolphin warrior knight guys. I don't know if you can see them. They're very small. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's one larger one that's demonstrating something to a mermaid woman, but there's a whole crew of them coming out. Now I'm going to give you what Franger says about this, and I'm giving you this because this shows you how insane Franger is, I think. Okay, so, do I have it? Oh, yeah. A company of dolphin knights in 2 close ranks comes swimming in from the left, all exactly alike, their faces hidden by lowered visors. In the cleft of a dowsing wand, they carry their emblem before them, the dolphin sacred to Apollo. Other dolphins frolic around them in the water. The dolphin belongs to the whale family and is a mammal. The Greeks revered it as the mother animal. The root of its name appears also in Adelphoi, meaning brothers of the same womb, and Delphi, the earth womb of the oracle of Apollo. Just as in the 6 months of winter, Apollo, the sun god, shares his oracle with its opposite, Dionysus, guide of the dead, so brothers of the same womb receive at once the bright lot of life and dark lot of death. On early Christian tombstones, the dolphin appears as a benevolent guide to the kingdom of the dead, just as it stood for a transitional stage in the soul's journey toward higher rebirth in the Pythagorean doctrine of metempsychosis. Clearly, so Franger says, clearly, the masked identical dolphin knights represent the greater army of the dead, the universal brotherhood on its way from temporal to eternal life. So clearly, that's what that is.
Sure.
Okay. So, I could have pointed out, Franger goes through and interprets basically every little aspect of this painting. I kind of wanted to pick, one that was convincing, one that other people talk about, and that sort of thing. I'm not 100% on board with this idea that he's part of a secretive cult. But maybe, right? Again, this is a strange painting. It's weird that this painting even exists. So why wouldn't the explanation be
There's
weird?
nothing else like it.
There really isn't. No,
Yeah.
there's people after him who tried to copy it, but before him, there's really nothing like this, right? Now, I'm going to segue here from the Franger interpretation to the Joseph Leo Corner interpretation, but I think it's important to point out a couple things before I get too deep. Corner says that what Franger did is sort of like anti-scholarship, and none of it actually makes sense. Now, we're going to get into that somewhat. Franger's going to make a reappearance in the After Dark episode when we talk about the Nazis. But one thing that's important to know is Corner does say that this is not a strictly Christian altarpiece, okay? But he also says the Adamite sect never existed, right? So if it's not Christian and it's not Adamite, well, what is it exactly? Okay, so let's get into the Joseph Leo Corner interpretation. So Joseph Leo Corner, he's a guy still alive. I watched a few of his lectures. He also wrote a book on Bosch and Bruegel, which I didn't read. I read so much and I found that kind of a little bit later, and his lectures were so good. He says that this is a painting of the enemy. Okay, this whole thing is about the enemy, and what's the enemy? The enemy is the self. Okay, so let's kind of walk through this a little bit. Partially, you got to think about, okay, this was, in Corner's interpretation, this painting was commissioned by Count Henry III of Nassau to be in his pleasure palace, to be a kind of cruel joke, right? Now, the question I have about that is, if it was commissioned to be a cruel joke, was Bosch in on the joke? Because that makes a difference, right? Did he just do it for money?
It does have the vibe of something that shouldn't exist. That is, I mean, if it's an altarpiece, what church would have it?
Exactly, right?
Yeah, right.
It doesn't. And so that's why the basic interpretation of, oh, it's just Christian propaganda doesn't work. I don't think it doesn't explain it, right? So we'll think about it is, if it was meant to be in this pleasure palace as a kind of a joke, as something to titillate and entice and maybe even use as blackmail, like, you get your friend, Count Henry III of Nassau gets somebody stirred up, and then he's got blackmail on him, right? He's like, you got excited, you got excited looking at the Bosch piece, right? Now I got you, like a compromat kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing Corner says, and I think this holds a lot of water, is that this entire painting is about the metaphysical history of desire. Now, in order to really understand this, we need to look at something. We need to go to the left panel, which is the garden panel, the Adam and Eve panel, and we look at Adam's sight line. Adam's sight line is slightly diagonal up and to the right, and it passes through Eve. And then it passes through what we called the vortex, that parade of men and animals, and in the central panel. And it keeps going, and it keeps going. And Adam in the left panel, lower left panel, is making direct eye contact with the tree man in the hell panel, who's turned around looking back at him. Do you kind of see that? How that makes a line?
Oh, yeah, I could see it.
Yeah. So the idea is Adam is presented with Eve. Desire is invented in that moment, right? It's the start of the free will of humanity. And then this leads to insanity, right? Like an emergency situation and complete breakdown, and ultimately ends in despair, a Dantean icebound inferno thing, right? Mm-hmm. I kind of buy that.
Yeah, a little bit.
That seems like there's something real there. Now, in some ways, this is like an inverted interpretation of Franger. Franger, basically, the two of them are sort of saying the middle panel is the same thing, that this is if the fall never happened, except Franger says it's a good thing, and Corner says Bosch doesn't think it's a good thing, right? It's similar interpretations, but flip sides of it.
Right. I think, I can see that.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about a couple things that Corner, some specific images that Corner talks about. Again, in the central panel, what we called the vortex, right? one thing Franger leaves out, the vortex is going counterclockwise. It's going to the left. Left is sinister in medieval times, right?
Sure. I mean, quite literally, that's the Latin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't think Franger is accounting for that, and I think it actually matters. Now, if you go just above the vortex to the middle of those 5 structures, you might have to zoom in kind of on this a little bit. There's a structure where the base of it is a blue orb. You see that with a hole in it?
I see the orb.
Yeah. In the hole is what I think is the only actual lewd sex act in the entire painting. It's dark. It's craven. It's like he's actually like reaching and grabbing her vagina. Like a lot of this stuff seems very childish in this painting, right? It's like, it's in some ways they're represented as adult bodies, but there is an aspect to a lot of it where, like, if you put 2 naked kids together, little kids together, what they would kind of do.
It's also a little cartoonish. Yeah, they're doing handstands.
Right.
They're leaning over, and there's like a little bit of a flower covering the rump. It's
right.
Terry Gilliam was clearly influenced by this Monty Python animator. Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, it's a little like fairyland almost.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then you go in this hole, and it's dark. Like, it's all of a sudden something is creepy about it. Korner says that this is the only actual sex act in the painting, that all of the rest of the stuff is almost sex or simulated sex or right at the edge of sex, but this is where it's actually happening. And I don't know, I just think that that's interesting. Also, it's directly in the central line of the painting, right down the middle of the painting. So if you were to, a triptych closes, right? If you were to open the painting, if you open the painting by a crack, you would see this image, this woman.
Yeah, just hang on here. I'm zooming in here.
It's small. It's quite small.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think this is like the only place where actual dirty sex is happening. Okay.
You're talking about the hole in the middle of the orb.
Yeah. There's like 4 people in there. One of them is just a butt. One of them, you just see the butt.
I just see the butt.
Yep. And then the one is a woman, and there's somebody like behind her, and then there's somebody sort of next to her who's reaching over and like grabbing her crotch area.
Sure.
Yeah. So, this suggests to us that this entire central panel is possibly about, as we call it on our show, sodomy. That's a callback for Oscar Wilde listeners.
Yes, indeed. Yes, sodomy. What did that come from in Oscar Wilde? Was it
that was when Oscar Wilde was sleeping with that guy whose father, the Queensberry guy,
of course, yeah.
He wrote on a note accusing him of sodomy.
Yes, that's right. I remember.
And I think like the libel case kind of depended on that misspelling or something. I remember right. Well, I didn't actually accuse him of sodomy. I accused him of sodomy, which is some other weird move. Yeah. Now, I think there's a good argument that this is about sodomy in some ways, because there's a lot of butts in this painting. Right? I don't think anybody can say there's not a lot of butts. I mean, the tree man's butt, the butt in that central aperture, you can see probably, 200 butts in the central panel.
Finally, we're getting to the Kelly interpretation of the Garden of Earthly Delights. Now, what you're looking at here, awful lot of butts.
Right. Yeah, this is about the moment when the butt was invented. And, it's...
You are correct. There are a lot of rumps.
There are a lot of rumps. Now, here's where I think it's interesting. Well, there's interesting aspects of there being a lot of rumps. One of them is, all right, so sodomy was actually a big deal to these people at this time.
Still a big deal.
It's still a big deal. We just don't prosecute people for it anymore.
Naturally.
In around Bosch's time, here's just some stats just to give you a sense of how seriously they took it. Around Bosch's time, in the city of Bruges, in the course of 50 years around Bosch's time, 90 people were executed for sodomy, for the most part, man on man. Right. This is one stat we have. So, you're killing somebody, a couple people every year just to make sure everybody knows what's up, all sex except for procreative sex was sinful. right? In this milieu.
Hmm.
I think to understand, I think there's two things to understand about this that Corner stresses is relevant to this painting. And the more I think about it, the more I think he's right, that it's helpful for understanding this painting. Why is sodomy wrong to these people, right? One reason is it's a turn away from God and a turn towards the self, and thereby a turn towards nothing, right? So there's a certain kind of evil to that, right? The idea being, this, the reason that sex is there, the reason that you have sexual compulsions is to encourage you to procreate, to engage in this narrative of humanity by contributing to it. And to do it in a way that doesn't do that or can't do that is sinful because it's a turn away from God. Okay, that's the religious interpretation. Now, Corner makes the point, and we can see that maybe in this painting, that like, hey, if you just go and have a bunch of sex for no reason, you end up in hell. There is a way of seeing the painting that way.
That would be a very simple, straight ahead, esoteric
is.
reading of the painting. Yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
Agreed. And I think there's a little bit of that there. Corner also makes an interesting point about, okay, well, sure, there's biblical religious reasons to be against sodomy. Why sociopolitically was it taken so seriously? Kerner makes the argument that if you could really crack down on sodomy, that exerted political control and governmental control right down into the bedroom and almost into people's heads, because it's governing like their most basic impulse to have, right? And I think there's some truth to that too, right? Like, yeah, if you can make somebody's compulsion illegal and they buy into that, what I think is illegal, it puts them right on the edge all the time and maybe makes them a little bit easier to control.
It's so good that we've come so far. We've really made it out of the dark ages, right, haven't we, Brad?
Right. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. So, and this feeds into why the Duke of Alba would have been so into it. This is a quote from Corner. This cosmic state of emergency, which we see in the central panel, sodomy, turning away from God, having sex with whatever butt passes by, right? Yeah. This cosmic state of emergency would have, this is a quote from Corner, this cosmic state of emergency would have fueled their urgency, meaning King Philip II, Duke of Alba, their urgency to crush with emergency powers all those who might be their subjects. So Kerner states this is like inflaming the passions to like turn you into like a tyrant of some kind, is kind of his point. Now,
we got to stop these butts. We got to stop these people.
Right. Well, it is one of those things. There is like you see this in like, well, men get, certain kinds of men get, like, this is a weird turn to take, but this is Art of Darkness. So men who become like serial killers of prostitutes or whatever, right? Often what happens is they get refused and rejected over and over and over again. Their compulsion gets like, slapped in the face, and it makes them insane in a violent way, right? It's like, okay, sure, then I'm just going to kill every woman that I come across. Like,
horrific.
So you can see where when you take those compulsions and you really screw with them, weird things can happen for sure.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the tree man again. More from the Corner interpretation, the fun little creature in the far right. Bosch actually drew this a number of times. In some of his extant drawings, we have the tree man. Kerner claims that Bosch uses this as a stand-in for himself, and that Bosch is putting him in there to kind of say, I'm in this game too. I'm in this cosmic game of desire that I'm fending off and fighting with myself. This is where we get the idea from Kerner that this is about the enemy being the self, about your own compulsions being the thing that makes you turn away from God and thereby turn towards nothingness, right?
So this tree man with the broken egg, this potentially is Bosch looking back at us.
Yeah, exactly. This is where my compulsions could lead me. Now, does that mean he was there's some speculation that he might have been a homosexual. I think saying somebody didn't have a kid, so they were a homosexual is a stretch. but
They always say that. They say that about anybody in history
anybody who didn't have a child. And it's like, well, there's a lot of reasons.
Speculation. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there could be hell, who knows? He might have lost his testicles in a farm accident. I don't know. Like, so anyway, that's what Kerner says. But interestingly, Kerner doesn't say anything about the bagpipe. And so it's like nobody gives you a full picture of this thing. Exactly. Now let's talk about another couple of things. One more thing, maybe two more things from the Kerner interpretation. One aspect of Kerner's interpretation that I find unsatisfactory. He talks about these 5 structures. There's also one structure in the Garden of Eden panel, but the 5 structures at the top of the central panel. Kerner basically says, oh, these are just oddities. At the time, elites liked to collect weird things. They would collect weird objects that looked somewhere between man-made and natural, which I agree these look somewhere between man-made and natural. So Kerner just kind of dismisses that. That's really all it is. It's just interesting stuff that somebody might have liked to have in there.
Yeah, just 5 things at the center of this incredible painting full of detail.
Right, that are just neat. I think they're neat.
Yeah.
So that's the one part where I'm like, I don't know about that. That seems a little off. Now the question is, okay, if the Kerner interpretation is true, what is Bosch like as a person? Bosch is a fairly orthodox religious person, but I think if Kerner is right, what we're seeing is a document on the order of St. Augustine's Confessions. We're seeing like a person who is very orthodox in their religiosity, but also confronting their own tendencies and desires and wrestling with them and realizing that like it's being a human being with free will is, could very well end in doom, right? Like,
and now that I know he is as urbane as he was, it might make sense too, right? Because you've got this fellow who's living in a cosmopolitan way,
right?
Very connected. So he's walking down the street and he's like, I can see her naked. I can see her naked. I can see her naked. Right. And he's wrestling with her. You're not supposed to. Yeah. So that's very interesting.
Yeah.
That's an interesting interpretation. And then these men riding all of the animals, that could be him, describing his own feelings of wrestling with these passions that are going
right. And these passions take me for a ride. I'm not controlling them; they're taking me for a ride, right?
Yeah,
and I'm caught up in it. It's
I'm
exciting.
sure we have no idea what that's like, do we?
Right, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
I've been in control every second of my life, Kevin.
We'll see what we can do about that on the After Dark.
Oh boy!
Okay.
All right, so. One more thing, because this is going to tie us into our next couple interpretations, which we aren't going to spend as much time on. Owls. Okay. There are owls everywhere in Bosch. Everywhere. I think there are 7 in the Garden of Earthly Delights. I could be wrong. There might be 5. There's plenty of them. And they're everywhere in all of his other paintings. I don't know that there is I don't know that there's a painting that we have the complete version of that does not have an owl in it by Bosch. Okay. Now, Kerner claims that in medieval times, and I've corroborated this in other places, that owls were thought of as sinister. There's a quote from somebody, I neglected to write down who wrote this, but it was from Bosch's time, who described owls as fatted on the excreta of their own ugliness. Now, here's an interesting tidbit, though. Owls in Dutch, apparently, are called Boschvogel.
Hieronymus
Bosch
birds.
Right. So in this way, they can be some kind of like emblematic double for Bosch, right? I just think that's really interesting. And I think they're so omnipresent, and the name thing and all, I think the owls might be sort of a key to this, right? Kerner just says, they're just evil. They're sinister, which I don't even think that that's necessarily wrong. But let's think at how Franger describes the owls, because he has probably the most sophisticated take on them. Okay. This is Franger talking about owls in Bosch. This last example, which relates the owl to the choice between good and evil, leads into its deeper symbolic significance. Because its eye can pierce the darkness, the owl stands for knowledge of hidden things and the power to see the invisible. It is one of those creatures which, as initiates and possessors of primeval knowledge, have been known from time immemorial, as Genesis says, knowing good and evil. The knowing evil is knowing death, whose dusky fields the owl crisscrosses in its flight. But the knowing good is the wisdom of God, Sophia. The owl has known them both since the beginning of the world. It saw death as the three-headed ibis writhing at the feet of the youthful creator of mankind, whose age, according to Joachim of Flores, flourishes in wisdom. So the ultimate meaning of the owl is that its wisdom is grounded in the knowledge and transcendence of death. It is not clear from all this that a cultic function, is it not clear from all this that a cultic function of the utmost importance determined the location of the focus of concentration at the dead center of the base of the fountain of life, where from the omnipresent, all-seeing, all-vivifying pupil of God's eye, the owl stares out at us. And that's what he's talking about specifically. Location is in the left panel, that crazy fountain in the middle. There's a hole in it with the owl. And that owl is dead center on the left panel.
I see it here now, yeah.
Right.
And then, of course, you have an egg in the middle, right? You have an owl, you have an egg.
Okay, now this is going to take us into another interpretation, this owl thing. Okay, I'm going to put away Franger for a bit.
Get out of here,
Franger. Wilhelm Franger.
Wilhelm. Oh, yeah, it's a very strong name.
It is.
I looked up Boschvogel, and there's a bistro, I assume in the Netherlands, called Bistro Boschvogel. Yeah.
Oh, really? Do they eat owl there?
I don't think they do. It's in... Oh, I'm not even going to try. Let me try. Ertrikia. Oh, boy.
Oh, yeah.
Ertika. Yeah. Nordstraat. Yeah, boy.
Oh, yeah.
Boy.
They're hard words.
Yeah, these are tough. Yeah. Boschvogel. I like it.
Yeah. Dutch words don't fit in my mouth.
Indeed.
They're weird. They're odd. They're hard for me. I mean, most other languages are, but Dutch in particular is strange for me. Okay. So I'm reading now from a book by Linda Harris. And this book is called The Secret Heresy of Hieronymus Bosch. Okay, and we're talking about owls again. If Bosch was a Cathar, then the Prince of the World would certainly have played an important part in his depictions of the earth. But does this actually happen? Bosch's earth is overrun by devils, but where is their leader, Satan? In fact, though Bosch only rarely depicts Jehovah and never paints Satan overtly, he frequently represents the evil deity in a symbolic form. As many art historians have noticed, there is one particular recurrent image which is present in nearly every picture that Bosch has produced. This omnipresent creature is the owl. The owl in the Middle Ages was usually thought of as either a symbol of the devil or an image of the Jews, who it was believed valued darkness more than light. If the owl had wisdom, it was the wisdom of darkness, witches, and the occult. The owl was seen in this way because it is a bird of night which hunts in the shadows. It watches its prey unseen, and its aim is to catch and ingest its unsuspecting victims. A bird associated with these images is a highly suitable symbol for the Cathar Prince of the World, who lurks in the realm of darkness, plotting to trap humanity here forever.
Yeah, rock and roll. Owls, man, owls. Owls are very cool.
I love owls. I mean, you know me.
Big fan.
You and I are, you're the owl man.
Indeed, yeah. Ich bin ein komischer Kauz.
Yeah, I've been collecting these little tchotchke owls for like years. Like I got 15 of them sitting right here. So I'm big into owls. Now, I think this owl thing is part of the key to getting some kind of understanding. Now, Linda Harris mentions Cathars. Kevin, I'm not trying to put you in the hot spot, but do you know what a Cathar is?
The Cathar heresy.
Yes.
That's what I'm familiar with. I don't know much more. I think, were they the ones who were accused of kissing each other on the arse, or was that the Templars?
Oh, they might have been that. They accused a lot of these Gnostics for doing that.
But of course, that's what they were. It was a Gnostic sect.
Yeah, they're a Gnostic movement primarily between the 12th and the 14th century, primarily in Southern Europe. They could trace its lineage back several hundred years to the Albigensians and the Bogomils. Funnily enough, I discovered, the term bugger for a gay guy? That comes from the Bogomils. Like hundreds of years have passed, apparently. You're a bogomil, you're a bugger. Eventually you're a bugger.
Well, those insults tend to stick, don't they?
They do. Yeah. Yeah. So there's no bogomils left for hundreds of years, but you can still be a bugger. In the early 1200s, the Cathars and other similar Gnostic sects were the target of a prolonged extirpation effort by the Catholic Church. Part of this was called the Albigensian Crusade, which more or less wiped them out, other than, like in an underground movement. I don't want to get sidetracked into like a prolonged discussion of what the Cathars were and their history and that kind of thing. But the focus of this book I just read from is that Bosch was a crypto Cathar. And she actually makes a pretty convincing case. Let's say I'm going to be kind of generalizing here big time, because the Cathars, a sect like this, it's not organized. It's like the Adamites. It's not organized the way the Catholic Church does. There's not a strict dogma. It's probably partially run by the laity and not the clergy. And so, every Cathar might have had a slightly different opinion. But let's summarize it this way. And any Cathars out there, please, engage with me on Twitter and tell me why I'm wrong.
We love to hear from our Cathar fan.
That's right.
And also, if you could induct us, bring us in. Bring us in.
I don't know, man. And the more I read about this Cathar, I might be a Cathar. I don't know.
I think I'm an Adamite.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. So in the Cathar faith, there is a God. We're going to call him God. And there's an evil God. We're going to call him Satan. There may, depending on what part of Catharism you're in, they're either of equal power and there's a higher God above the God above God, or there's a good God is the God above God, and then there's the bad God who's the demiurge who created the realm that we live in, right? Humans in this idea are actually angels that have been seduced by one means or another and then trapped in this realm as part of or ahead of a war in heaven. And you can match this with the broader Gnostic idea that we're trapped light in this realm, and that our objective is supposed to be to reunite ourselves with the greater light, which is God, right? Cathars believed that if you were not able to escape the lure of Satan, then you were doomed to reincarnate. So they believed we lived like in PK Dick's Black Iron prison, and your job was to try and escape by right living and coming to terms with God.
Not very doctrinal. Not in line with the one true Holy Catholic, Roman Catholic Apostolic Church.
No, you're correct there.
Heresy. Burn them. Burn the witches.
I don't even know if you're comfortable with this kind of talk, Kevin. I mean, maybe.
No, this is fascinating. The idea that there were semi-major, I mean, I don't know how major they were, but fringe Christian movements where reincarnation was a fixture of the movement.
Right.
That's quite...
It's right. It definitely throws you off, and not to say it's right or anything, but it definitely it tilts your idea of the history of the church a little bit. You're like, wait, what? Like,
and the whole of Europe, really. Yeah.
And there was a crusade. I mean, there was a crusade. There was a directed effort. Like, you know what? We got to wipe these people out. Right.
Yeah.
And there were Cathar enclaves, and like, there were, this was a thing. I don't know numbers wise, but you think about it in America, like what's the percentage of, say, Muslims in America? It's 5% or 2%, something in that range.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It'd be like if they decided we got to wipe out Kanye fans.
Right. Right.
They're becoming too powerful.
Right. Yeah. It would. You could do it, but it wouldn't be that easy, right? There's a
No,
lot of them.
it
Yeah,
wouldn't be pleasant.
right. So, so now I'm going to give you some reasons why this might be true. But first, we gotta understand a couple of trickle down effects that Bosch, being a Cathar, what he would have then believed. Okay, you would believe that this world is literally evil that we live in. Some
I'm on board with
Cathars,
that.
yeah, some Cathars believed that matter was literally demon feces. Matter
Yeah.
itself was demon feces.
Yeah,
Right?
again, I'm on board with that.
Because of this, many Cathars and many other Gnostic sects believe that procreation was a sin, really, because what right do you have? You're trapping light in an evil dimension. Like, that's not the way to go, right?
You lost me here, but
Right.
that's okay.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
They would. There's some other interesting kind of effects. They would only eat fish because at that time they believe fish came about because of spontaneous generation.
Aha.
Yeah, and many other foods they believed encouraged sex. So
You know
milk,
what would be amazing
cheese,
would
butter,
be to
eggs.
have a guy who was a real serious method actor,
Yeah.
on like a Christian Bale level method actor,
Yeah.
who sort of creates a social media account where he pretends to be the last Cathar, and he goes on Rogan. No, man, I only eat fish.
Only fish.
So what you're telling me is that you have an only fish diet. Yeah, because the fish, they spontaneously form. I don't know about that.
Jamie, pull up that video of salmon spawning.
The Cather's like, no, bro, I don't.
White.
Yeah, I don't. The last Cathar on Rogan.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Also, if you're a Cathar, you smelled really good because you believed that water was bad. And in particular, baptism was evil. So you're not bathing ever. And you kind of think about this. There is a way that this sort of makes sense. If you don't drink water, you die. And when you die, you come right back. It's like water is this way that material reality has its hooks in you, right? It's like what bonds you to the earth in a way. But this is the question: is like, why aren't they all just killing themselves?
Yeah, that's that argument, right? Where somebody's like, "I'm a nihilist." All right, let me shoot you. No.
Yeah,
well, okay.
Like this realm is. I guess you would say that you're gonna go. You just come right back. So killing yourself maybe sets back your progress or something.
Just burns too many calories or something.
Yeah. Right. So I don't know. So it's an odd religious sect. I think it's interesting, I think all of these things are interesting. But let's talk a little bit. I'm going to read a little bit from the Linda Harris book, a little bit more about just Catharism. No one can deny that the Cathars followed the ideals of the New Testament. So they pretty much just ended up lining up. I mean, they followed the 10 Commandments, all of these things. They weren't like Adamites where they were having like, naked sermons or anything like that. No one can deny that the Cathars followed the ideals of the New Testament and viewed the ordinary people of the world with sympathy and understanding. As they saw, the souls of these people were spiritually alive and could be enlightened and saved. The problem was that not everyone fit into this category. Like the Manichaeans before them, the Cathars believed that certain souls had been committed colleagues of Satan from the start. NPCs. These souls were seen as spiritually dead and beyond all hope of salvation. The Cathars carried this idea so far that they believed some people were literally demons in human form. These demons were often the richest and most powerful members of society and the church, and the inquisitors were undoubtedly included among them.
Ooh, that's going to make them real popular.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you are a demon.
Yeah, exactly.
Why?
Exactly.
Because I say so.
Right.
And I stink.
Right.
They're not hard to find.
Oh, they wouldn't be hard to find. Yeah, you just sniff them out. Yeah. It smells like fish in your hut, Bosch. Yeah. Fish and BO.
Oh, man.
We're going to take you in front of the tribunal.
Indeed.
Now, the evidence for ongoing Catharism in Bosch's time and place is scant at best. But there are a handful of court proceedings leading into the 15th century, so it's not really impossible. And here's the best historical evidence for it, okay? In the 1230s, so this is 200 years plus before Bosch, Conrad of Marburg had made an effort to stamp out Cathars in a kind of German Inquisition, particularly in the Cologne, Bonn, and Trier area. Now, Bosch, as we said, his real name is Hieronymus or Jerome or Jeremiah Van Aken, suggesting his family was originally near from the town of Aachen, which is actually where the Cathar heresy was quite prevalent. Now, 1230 was where this German Inquisition happened. The earliest documented arrival of a Van Aken in this town of Sertigenbosch is in 1250. So the speculation would be they got stamped out over here. We went to Den Bosch and tried to recreate our lives there. And we're just humble painters, and we don't know anything about Cathar heresy, right?
We just paint the craziest paintings you've ever seen.
Right.
Yeah. With a lot of butts.
Yeah, we're just normal folks. Now watch this. Yeah.
Normal people painting butts over here.
Hundreds of them. I see butts everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
Call it the devil's cabbage. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Oh,
yeah. And we take kind of rap names. We name ourselves after the town. We move from one town to the next. And now I'm Hieronymus Bosch.
Right.
And I have the emperor's ear if I want it. I can talk to my guy and he knows the emperor and who am I? Yeah, wild.
Yeah, interesting. This is weird. Like, I think when I said earlier on, I wanted to quadrangulate who Bosch was from this. I don't think any of these interpretations give the full picture. I think the Cathar and the Adamite ones are a little bit out there, are probably too far out there. But I don't think they're 100% wrong. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of images here in the Cathar thing, and I want to kind of keep moving. First thing, you see all of the pink in this painting? There's pink everywhere.
Which painting are we talking about?
The Garden of Earthly Delights still.
Yes, of course.
There's pink everywhere, right?
Yes.
According to Linda Harris, pink is symbolic of the material world. So it's a very sensual color, right? And you can see how it would represent the kinds of things that Satan is using to lure you and keep you in this world. I mean, it looks like genitals. Pink is the color of, idealized genitals, right? So all those women who love to wear pink, they are demonic forces trying to lure you and trap you.
Of course, yeah. Brad, in the course of the episode, has become a Cathar. This has been an initiation.
Yeah, I believe it.
We prepare for some real craziness during what will now be the third hour as we go into that. Yep. Classic Art of Darkness episode. Another. We're not done. I declare it a certified banger.
Good. Well, we're getting there.
I got boshed.
We're all going to be boshed by the end of this, man.
Yeah, man.
Okay, so another thing, birds. There are birds friggin' everywhere in this. Now, some commenters have said the birds are bigger than the humans, so this suggests some kind of fairyland thing, which I don't know. I don't know how much fairies were in Dutch culture, but maybe this is some kind of fairyland thing. I don't really know if there's enough evidence for that, but there are birds everywhere. Harris claims that in the medieval era, not only were owls sort of evil, but birds in general were thought of as having kind of sinister vibes.
We've come full circle, of course, because now we know that birds are not real.
Birds are not real, right? Exactly.
Birds aren't real.
That's a Cathar. That's a Cathar interpretation.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I couldn't really nail down anything about this birds being sinister thing because I kept finding alternative interpretations, and it sounds like you got to go specific bird to bird. So
that's what I would think. I think it would be species by species.
Yeah. So I don't think you can say anything generally about birds in general in the medieval era were evil. I think that's way too broad of a brush.
Indeed.
Yeah. But it is a good question. Why are there so many birds in this painting? I think that's a fair question. Another thing I want to point out, and Linda Harris is the only interpretation that does try to explain this, is there are all these round and varying sizes. There's a lot of round shapes, and she calls these angel seeds. If you look in the central panel, they're everywhere. There are big ones and small ones. There are clumps of them in that body of water, sort of near the Dead Can Dance thing, but up to the right. There's a big blueberry that a bunch of people are eating off of.
Yeah, I see it.
That.
No,
yeah.
I see it.
And then there's ones all over. Below that, there's a guy carrying an oyster with some people having sex inside of it, probably. And then below that, there's a woman with 2 cherries on her head. That maybe that's testicles. But you see these little circles, these little spheres all over the place. Linda Harris claims these are representative of souls that are being sort of processed by material reality. So the red ones are sort of inflamed with passions. And this is the evil god Satan this is symbolic of Satan harvesting these souls and locking them into material reality. The problem is when they go gray or black, that person is lost, according to Linda Harris. And now that represents a demon. And you'll see them in the far right panel. There are gray ones. If you look around, there are gray and blackish ones all over the place. So she's the only person who really makes any attempts to explain that. The vortex of animals that we've talked about through our various interpretations, Harris says this is a powerful image of reincarnation, which indicates that if you're just driven by your carnal desires to procreate, you just keep coming back. Like you're never going to get out of this loop, right? Which that's possible. And it's a sort of an evil loop because it goes around to the left, right? Now, we'll talk about Harris's interpretation, the Cathar interpretation of the tree man, which I think Harris's is, I don't think Harris has the best one. I mean, she basically says, this is Satan. The egg there is broken because the egg always breaks. The big cavern in the buttocks with the tavern in it. It's a fairly straightforward interpretation of that being Satan. One thing I do want to point out, though, it's hard to see because it's the same color as the body of the tree man, but he's got a bandage on his leg. I don't know if you can make that out. On his right, and I guess it would be his right leg. There's a wrapped bandage.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah,
I had not noticed it. Yeah, but now that you pointed out, he has.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Harris claims that a wound on the leg is representative of like possession by evil in this time, which is a strange symbolic. I don't know if that's actually true or that's something that Linda Harris has kind of cobbled together, but maybe. I mean, I can't explain why that wound is there. It is kind of weird, right?
To me, it just seems to reinforce. If I'm just looking at what I'm seeing, it seems to reinforce the stuckness of the creature. The creature,
it's falling apart, kind of, to me. Yeah. No, I see. Yeah, and so I don't think you've got to go that far. But we're going to look briefly at another painting and see a similar thing and speculate a little. Now, here's the great thing about like a Franger or a Linda Harris interpretation. I realized the one good thing about having a wackadoo interpretation like this is because you're representative of a secretive cult, anything in there that's contradictory to your theory, you just say, well, Bosch had to hide some stuff.
Yes.
Right? He had to be hiding. He can't just put it all out there, right? And it's like, well, that is true, but it's also, yeah.
They know where to find him.
Right.
Yeah.
You just sniff. Give a sniff. Put your nose in the air. But so in some ways, it's like, yeah, I guess if he was a Cathar, he would have to kind of go with the flow a little bit. But it's kind of overly convenient in some ways. Now, here's one thing: if he is a Cathar, Bosch should. A couple of things. He should have some hatred for the hypocrisy of the church. Right, because to him, if he is a Cathar, right, we're putting ourselves in the mindset of Bosch as a Cathar. The church, the clergy, and all that, they're demons. Their interest is they're in league with Satan, right? To keep you lured in material reality.
Yikes.
Right? Yeah. So that's interesting. So we should see something along those lines in Bosch's work, right? Kevin, I don't know, in that email I sent another painting, Adoration of the Magi. I think it's the first attached painting.
I will look it up. I will find it. 1 second.
Okay. Yeah, so the Adoration of the Magi is actually another triptych, but we're just going to look at the central panel of it. And Adoration of the Magi is a typical painting where many painters would do interpretations of it. It's the moment where, the newborn Christ is being brought in, is being, the three wise men are bringing gifts to him, right? And there's 1,000 versions of the Adoration of the Magi. Harris looks at this particular painting fairly deeply and makes some interesting points about it. And I'm going to read just a little bit. The nativity scene in the central panel is so odd, eccentric, and disturbing that one wonders how Seguinza could have accepted it as normal. That's Seguinza as a previous interpreter of Bosch. In fact, what its symbolism reveals is surely not traditional piety, but rabidly anti-conventional. In the foreground, Bosch has represented the Magi in front of the stable. The three kings pay homage to a Madonna and Child who look stiff and unreal. They have been compared by Gibson, another art historian, to cult statues rather than living figures. This concept is very unusual, but it is not heretical in itself. What is odd and completely unprecedented is Bosch's implied opinion of the Magi who worship the cult statues. These kings are not the positive figures which are depicted so often in traditional Christian art. Instead, they are shown to be sinful and unsound in some way by the demons and other images of evil that decorate their clothes and gifts. Now, it's hard to find a good enough resolution image to understand this whole the images of evil that are on their clothes and gifts, but there are some odd images. The one of the gifts that the Christ child is given is the sacrifice of Isaac in a small statuesque form, which maybe isn't that unusual, but it's squashing a frog or a reptile or something, which is strange. And then there's just some odd things on their clothing that don't make a whole lot of sense, sort of demonic figures on their clothing. Now, there's also, this might be hard to see too, but within the hut, sort of within there's no room at the inn, right? So the Christ child is born in the manger. In the manger, there's some people, which is strange. Why are there people in the manger? All of the wise men are out.
Well, they'd be in the barn. Yeah,
in the barn. Yeah,
in the barn. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but
the manger is the thing that the animal eats from.
Oh, right. It's the actual trough with the hay trough, right? So they're in the barn. But there's these other people in the barn. And one of them, Harris claims, the one that's kind of leering out, he's sort of half naked, his robe is falling out, he's wearing an unusual headpiece. Linda Harris says that's a member of the clergy. That's like a depraved member of the clergy that he's representing. And he has, it's hard to see in any resolution, but he does have a wound on his leg again, which Harris says is a symbol of being possessed by like evil knowledge. So,
goodness.
What is that figure?
You're right.
Don't know.
I mean,
it's very strange.
The Magi on the left has some sort of almost looks like a dragon or something that it's holding.
Right.
And then when you look at his garb, those look like thorns as much as plants. Right. Yeah, very interesting.
It's weird, right? And yeah, so it's strange stuff. And she points out a number of other things in this painting, and I'm gonna point out one of them that's also gonna help me make another point, because here's the thing. We said early on, Bosch is a member of the Brotherhood of the Swan. It's a prominent social circle, confraternity, directly related to St. John's Cathedral. Now, Bosch is a member of this. The easy thing to say is, well, then he must have been a devout Catholic, right? I mean, it's the only thing that makes sense. He's a part of this thing. I think, people join social groups like that for all number of reasons. It might have been just a networking opportunity, right? Just because you're a member of a group doesn't mean you believe in the group, right? I think that's fair to
Although
say.
if you join our Telegram at artofdarkpod.com, you can find the link to the Telegram. You immediately assume, we assume that everything that we say, you're totally on board.
Right. That's right.
If
That's
we
right,
become
of course.
Cathars, you become
You become
Cathars.
Cathars. You're
We're
riding with us. Right.
Afterwards, yeah. During post-production, you and I, Brad, have to decide Cathar, Adamite.
Right.
Cathar, Adamite.
Yeah,
Sex
we can't.
party.
Yeah, and we can't just wander from one to the next. You got to pick one and ride
right.
with it.
Yeah. We're ride or die. Ride or die Adamite party over here.
I love it. Okay, so now I think this painting, Gift of the Adoration of the Magi, does at least imply some criticism of the church. But what about criticism of the Brotherhood of the Swan? Okay. You can't see this in every version of the Adoration of the Magi. It's very, very small. But in many versions that I've found, I found one version that didn't have it for some reason. It was very strange. But you might not even be able to see it unless you have a very high resolution version. In the background, almost due left of the peak of the barn, there is a small building that has birds flying around it, which apparently whorehouses were often called birdhouses at this time, or something like that. Birds were often slang for sex. Would usually use birds, often use bird slang, apparently. And it's clearly like a tavern and or whorehouse, and from it is a flag with a swan on it. And the implication is by Linda Harris is that he was basically saying, look, the Brotherhood of the Swan it's just a bunch of dudes hanging out, drinking. There's nothing religious about it, right? And I think that's pretty interesting. Now, there's another painting, and I'm not going to bring it up because there's only one thing I want to look at. But there's another painting called the Marriage at Cana. I think I'm pronouncing that right, Cana. And this is a Bible story. This is where the Bible story where Jesus turned water into wine. I think we're all pretty familiar with that, right? Now, in that painting, there's several, but there's one very interesting detail in which sort of waiters are coming in, two of them. One has a platter with a boar head on it, and one has a platter with a swan on it. Okay, they're coming into this wedding party, bringing this to the same wedding party where Jesus is eating. Now, okay, the swan. Well, what's the big deal with the Brotherhood of the Swan? They ate swan dinners. And what's the big deal with boar? You're going to eat a boar. Well, at this time, the boar was associated with the Pope. And the swan, fine, the Brotherhood of the Swan. The issue is they both have moons on it. What do you call it when it's just a little bit of a moon?
Crescent.
Thank you. I couldn't find that word. They both have crescent moon symbols on them, which was a symbol of both the Ottomans and thereby Satan. So you have the Marriage of Cana painting where they're eating boar and swan, but it's Satan tainted. So I don't know what to make of all this. This is the kinds of things that Linda Harris uses to try and convince us. Now, that wouldn't mean that Bosch is a Cathar, those boar and swan thing, but I do think it suggests that he had some real skepticism about the church. It's hard to understand what that would mean if it wasn't skepticism of the church. Exactly. So I think she makes a good case, not so much that maybe he was a Cathar, but that he had real deep issues with the church itself. Now, I'm kind of almost done with Linda Harris. One thing I do want to point out, she's the only one who makes a strong claim that Bosch actually left Den Bosch at some point and traveled to Venice, which I thought was really interesting. Venice during Bosch's time is the only place in the world that could even conceivably be called a hotbed of Catharism, according to her research. And she claims there's evidence in some paintings and some drawings that he met Leonardo da Vinci, which temporally is possible because they were almost exact contemporaries, Bosch and Leonardo.
Oh, interesting.
She claims that Da Vinci's, and I do encourage people to look this drawing up. She claims that Da Vinci's drawing allegory with wolf and eagle is clearly Bosch inspired. And I I think she's got a reasonable argument there, actually. It could be Bosch inspired. My question is, he doesn't have any family. Why not just move to Venice? But, if you're a Cathar and that's where the Cathar, well, I don't know. It seems tenuous. But that's another big interpretation. I mean, she wrote a whole book on it. It's well referenced. It's actually fascinating for its history of Catharism alone, and sort of what the thought, what the set of thoughts and ideas were. It's pretty fascinating. Now, the question then becomes: so, did he do? If he was a Cathar, was he making this altarpiece for some kind of Cathar church? I guess that would have to be what it's for. The Garden of Earthly Delights, that is. Are they able to commission that from him? And then how did Count Henry III of Nassau get it from the Cathar Church, and why wasn't that publicized in some way? And then why would you take a sacred object to this heretical cult and then it becomes a sacred object to you as well, right? It's very
I feel
strange.
like we're in the realm of a secret society within a society, and it's all connected, and it's hard to know who belongs and
right
running the show and how much did Bosch know. And
that's you're hitting exactly where I'm coming at it. I think is right where you're at, Kevin, where it's like, it's not that he was an Adamite, it's not that he was a Cathar, it's not that he was any one of these specific things, but that whatever he was overlaps a little bit with all of these things in some way, sort of circumstantially. So I do think he was part of maybe some unnamed in history group or thought process or whatever, something unusual. And this is going to take us to our last, and this one's quick. This is our last interpretation. This is the St. Anthony's Fire ergotism theory. Okay.
Ergot.
Ergot, yes.
So, Cogito ergot sum.
It's not the same ergot, I don't think.
I made a very nerdy joke.
I like that. So 1984, this woman, Lorinda Dixon, publishes an article called Bosch's quote-unquote St. Anthony Triptych, an apothecary's apotheosis, in which she posits that at least the St. Anthony Triptych, it's probably his second best painting. I did email it to you, Kevin. You can pull it up. We're not going to talk very many specifics about it. She claims it's heavily influenced by and centered on St. Anthony's Fire, symptoms and effects, as well as its treatment and, for the time, the spiritual dimensions. We got to talk a little bit about what St. Anthony's Fire is. We now know it's poisoning by a fungus, specifically a rye smut called ergot. Now, okay, what's the big deal? You basically got some kind of weird infection. This is the same fungus from which Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD. This is the same fungus that is thought to be, by reputable sources, to have been the source of kykeon in the Eleusinian mysteries, right? For people, we're not going to go deep in the Eleusinian mysteries, but yeah.
Bosch be tripping.
Bosch, exactly. That's the thing. Did he have St. Anthony's Fire and translate this into visionary experiences, right? Now, in his time, they didn't know what this thing was. It was assumed it was sort of like a demonic possession, basically, right? And it was assumed that it was called St. Anthony's Fire because, for people who don't know, St. Anthony's sort of famous for having this trial out in his cave in which he survived temptation by demons and onslaught by demons. And it's a painting it's a moment that's represented by many painters, not only Bosch, but Michelangelo and a bunch of one of my favorite ones is this one Michelangelo did when he was like 16, apparently, of the Temptations of St. Anthony. So the thought is St. Anthony had this, it's called St. Anthony's Fire, and it was some kind of demonic possession. Now, how big of a deal was St. Anthony's Fire? Well, it wasn't as big a deal as, say, the Black Plague, but even now, like if you or I were to get accidentally dosed with ergot, there's a 1 in 10 chance that we would die, right?
I don't like that. I don't like those odds. Not
So
good.
you have to imagine in the Middle Ages, it was even worse, right? It had to have been 2, 3, 4 times that, right? So a very high number. And it was fairly common. In 1418, there's a record in Paris of 50,000 people dying in 1 month.
Oof.
And that was when Paris had a population less than 30,000. So in 1 month, 1 in 6 people died of ergot in Paris.
That's no good.
I
don't like that.
No,
yeah.
It's pretty serious.
God, we forget how difficult times were. Oh my God.
Yeah, and you had no idea what it was. I mean, it's demonic possession. We don't nobody knows what to do, and it's a horrible you have muscle contortions, convulsions, they call it St. Anthony's fire because you have agonizing burning pain that nobody can do anything about.
Oof.
And then you have hallucinations, right? And the one symptom I missed, you will also often get gangrene, and they have to cut parts of your body off.
Ugh.
Right. So horrific disease. Now,
and you're French.
And you're and you're a Catholic. You've never bathed. I mean, there's really nothing good happening.
You're eating swan. I mean,
yeah, there's
terrible.
There's 2 good things could possibly happen in your life. Now, it was a big enough deal that there were St. Anthony infirmaries set up specifically to treat ergotism all across Northern Europe. Now, nobody knew what caused it. The one thing that they thought would work to cure it through divine intercession, you take all of the various herbs, the most expensive and best versions of these herbs that had been known to work for some cases. Probably what it is, you give somebody something and they happen to survive. So you're like, oh, this one works, right? That's what a lot of that stuff is.
Indeed.
Yeah. So what they would do with this was the best cure that people had. They would pour wine infused with these herbs over the bones of St. Anthony, and then you would drink that wine. It was called the Holy Vintage.
Oof.
Yeah,
that's
right?
That's pretty hardcore.
That's pretty hardcore, right? And I mean, became such a thing that there's archivists or whatever have compiled something like 60 complete skeletons of holy vintage bones. So people were totally counterfeiting it, right?
Flim flamming.
Right. Oh,
yeah,
totally
these are the bones.
Yeah, this is a bone. It's like a chicken bone. Yeah. Now, there were other cures, though. It wasn't just that. One of the big ones is, to understand the approach of the cures, you have to know what the Galenic method of health and medicine is. Kevin, do you know anything about the Galenic method? Yeah.
Gaul, French, right?
I believe so. Yeah.
Sure.
The idea was that you had hot, cold, wet, and dry. You had to balance these all out.
Oh, I totally relate to that. I'm like that right now. I'm a little dry.
Yeah.
right now. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So if you're dry, you gotta take something that's wet. If you're hot, you gotta take something that's cold. You gotta try to balance these things out. Ergotism was considered to be the hottest and driest of the diseases. So you need the coldest and wettest of remedies. This included fish. This included mandrake root. Okay, these were the 2 biggest ones. Now, Kevin, if you pull up that St. Anthony's triptych, I think I might have told you not to bother, but I think it's worth pulling up.
I have
last attached one. Ooh, that's kind of small. Okay, so if you look into the...
Oh, yeah, there's a fish in the middle.
There's a fish in the middle, and then there's also, I believe it's the... trying to find exactly where it is. There is a... I should have got a bigger one. There is a woman on here who is a grandmother-looking figure whose head and arms look like mandrake root and whose bottom looks like a fish. She has a mermaid bottom, and she's sitting on a rat, and she has a baby. And then next to her is some kind of thistle man. Thistle was also considered a cold remedy. So I think this is pretty clearly Bosch putting in some kind of ergotism stuff in here, putting the cures for these things in there. Now there's also Lorinda Dixon goes into some pretty convincing stuff about alchemical devices being shown in not only St. Anthony's, the Temptation of St. Anthony, but Garden of Earthly Delights, and that those weird structures were sort of interpretations of alchemical devices
Sure.
and things, which
Yeah,
I
I can
think
see
is
that.
I think is somewhat convincing. Not being by any means an expert, an expert in any of this, but not an expert in alchemical devices. I think that's fairly convincing. So her point is, in particular, the St. Anthony triptych, but also maybe all of his work, that you would have this as an altarpiece in a St. Anthony's infirmary. And while you were trying to survive ergotism, this would be like a meditation piece. It was the spiritual dimension of it, because you're trying to fight demons too, right? It's not, you're taking this stuff, but in your mind, you're fighting a demon to get this thing out of your body. And this was be an inspirational altarpiece to aid people who are trying to survive this. But the suggestion would be that the imagery Bosch was able to derive because he'd been afflicted by ergotism and gotten over it. And if it's one of the only ways to actually trip in the 1400s, I think there's a reasonable claim there.
Yeah, and he was an artist of enough talent to be able to bring back the experience of the trip. So you would say that then this painting would have come before the Garden of Earthly Delights.
I think it does, and I think I believe that's how Ludwig Baldass, which literally is the name of one of the earliest people to do a biography of Bosch.
Ludwig Baldass.
Yeah, that's how it's spelled, Baldass.
Okay.
He said that
perfect Bosch scholar.
Exactly. He was
made for this. Right? He got in front of the Garden of Earthly Delights and he said, "Finally, it's my calling. Look at all these bald asses. I'm ready to go. I know what I'm getting my PhD in."
That's right. Yeah, it's a pretty good aptonym for sure. That's hilarious. I just see him looking at, yes, bald asses, yes.
I don't know why, but I'm drawn to this painting. I feel right at home. I've been wandering the wilderness.
Yeah. What do you think, Dr. Enormous Bird? Yes.
Yeah, I know what I'm writing about for the next 30 years.
Yeah. So I attached one painting that's not a Bosch to sort of drive this point home, because I do think there's something to this ergotism interpretation. And this is an ayahuasca painting based on just for you, Kevin, to see it. Sort of like, that's what people who've undergone ayahuasca will paint. And then you see there's something Boschian about that, right? You can see how this might have been turned into this is a man who survived possession by a demon and is now bringing back the spiritual lessons that he's learned to aid other people through the process. Who knows? Now, there are other Bosch interpretations. I'm not going into them because that seems like enough for us to wrestle with, and I think those are the 4 or 5 most convincing. What do you think of Bosch now, Kevin?
I feel like I know less than I did when we began, because when we began, I knew next to nothing, and now I have so many questions. Right. I really did not. I guess if you had pressed me, I might have thought maybe we might abut. No pun intended. We might abut some secret society business, but I didn't quite. It didn't quite dawn on me. I knew that the Garden of Earthly Delights was this standout freak painting in history. And I recall we were in Brussels once, and I do recall, I think we saw a number of Bosch paintings, although
you may have in Brussels.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It sounds like a lot like some of the major ones are in the Prado. It just reminds me how fascinating and interesting this late medieval, early modern period is, and how much closer to these folks we are than our mediocre educations would have us believe,
Right.
because there's this artificial rift that's created this idea that the Enlightenment, and then there's everything before, and that those are the Dark Ages.
Yeah, it's
and
just
then,
a bunch of dirty
fuzzy,
peasants
and they
back
were
there.
crazy. Yeah, and it's like, whoa, slow down. There's way more going on. Obviously a great talent. I really appreciated the point that you made just on sort of just dissecting the various pieces that he would have pulled from in order to paint, to conceive of, and then draw the Garden of Earthly Delights. I had never. That's a painting that you probably should pause over for an hour and ponder. And so I saw a bunch of new things in there, little palette things. There's that golden kind of ruddy russet kind of orangish thing that goes from the left to the middle to the right in hell. It's all connected, and there's way more stuff going on.
There's one. Let me point out one thing that I meant to point out.
Okay.
In the Garden of Earthly Delights, the background, the skyline of all three panels is consistent.
Right.
Okay. And now I know that doesn't seem like a big deal, but hell is supposed to be like a different physical place that you go to. Right. So there is something like he's saying this is all in the same plane. This is all in the same world.
It's all a state of mind, baby.
It's exactly. I think that's pretty
all
interesting.
A state of mind.
Yeah.
Well, what year did he die, Brad?
1516.
1516.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to say for the final time on the core episode, the main episode, I just got boshed.
You did get boshed.
My butt got boshed, man. Well, we have to. Can I ask you? I want to ask you the classic Art of Darkness closing question before we go on and do the Patreon only After Dark episode. We're going to talk about Bosch and the Nazis at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Please do support the show. We put a lot of effort into these episodes. We buy an awful lot of books. I'm prepping for the Artaud episode. These are books that I'm not getting at the local library here. So if nothing else,
Oh, dude. What I went through to get a reasonable price on this Franger, I'll tell you.
Yeah. Man. Yeah. So if exactly. Wow, you got Frangered. Frangered in the Bosch. Yeah, but if you value what we're doing, and if nothing else, like go and leave us 5 stars on iTunes, Spotify.
Yeah, that's super helpful.
We really earnestly do enjoy hearing from people who listen to the show. We love feedback, and I mean, it always makes my day when somebody randomly says, "Hey," it comes to me on Twitter and says, "Hey, that Brad Kelly guy, total hack, but you, Kevin, your episodes." Really,
I'll tell you, Kevin, I get a surprising number of comments exactly like that. So
very interesting. But let's close with the closing question, which is, Brad, what do you think Hieronymus Swan Eater Bosch would be doing now if he was alive today?
I think you have to consider what I understand about his psychology from doing this. And I'm not saying I understand a lot about it, but the little that I feel like I may understand about how his mind works, he is drawing from a great number of sources. And I think whatever you settle on for being his sort of religious outlook, it's complicated. No matter you think he's a Cathar or an Adamite or just a Catholic, even if he's just a Catholic, it's sophisticated and complicated, and he understands a lot, and he's excellent at representing things symbolically and understanding them. So I think he would be in the visual arts, but I think you would be seeing some kind of dramatic innovation in how disparate sources are pulled together. I mean, maybe he'd be working in something like multimedia and video or something like that, but I think you would be seeing a dramatically schizophrenic repackaging of things that you didn't think went together. And I think it would be pretty impressive. Yeah.
And I'm not making a joke here. I could see him making a crazy NFT set. That would do all sorts of crazy stuff, and then interact with a game, or something. Yeah, I have a feeling he'd be there for sure.
Let me end it with the one quote we have from him himself. We have one piece of writing Let me just find it. And it's
Well,
on
well-
go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
Yeah.
after you.
It's on a drawing called "The Trees Have Ears, the Fields Eyes," and it's just a note he wrote. Most miserable, and it's translated in English, obviously. Most miserable is the mind that uses always invented things, always imitating, never inventing anything itself. So he wanted to make things new. He was like a modernist in a way, which I find pretty interesting.
I was going to say he seems like a very early modern,
Mm-hmm.
which connects him to us through time.
Yeah.
Brad, excellent job. I cannot
Thanks,
wait
man.
to hear about Bosch and the Nazis and whatever heresy we land on, whatever doctrinal sins we commit, we're going to do it together
That's
at artofdarkpod.com.
Booyah. You got boshed.
Hang on here. I'm just gonna go. Look at the Garden of Earthly Delights for 4 hours.
Sounds fun.